Do you ever get the feeling that social media might just be siphoning the life out of you? Because I'm starting to feel like it's not just me. And although I do believe in the value of being informed and knowing what's happening in the world, because otherwise, how would you ever do anything about it? I can't help but feel that being digitally bombarded by an endless stream of overstimulation and terror just can't be that good for me. And it's not just social media, right? It's the news, it's the internet, it's seemingly everywhere, and it's intentionally designed to reel us in and keep us stuck in this loop of digital overconsumption until we don't feel that great. It has mental health consequences for most of us, if not all of us. And so it's no surprise we find ourselves feeling alone, overwhelmed, burnt out. Sound familiar? And unfortunately, yes, the horrors of the world do persist. But so do I, and so do you. And that's what today's video is about. It's about how to persist in finding joy, connection, hope, resilience, inspiration in these tumultuous times. Welcome back to Loom-In-Essence, the series where I share my artistic adventures building experimental bead looms, and we talk a little bit about art and a lot about life. I am your host and artist, Shine. Today I'll be sharing one of my recent works with you titled Now More Than Ever, The Ocean Has You, which explores our relationship with nature as a source of physical and mental well-being. In this episode, first I will be covering the technical side of things, so I'll be talking about the different experiments that I conducted over the course of the piece, which I'll be doing a lot of this season because the aim of this season is to create my first large-scale piece. So I'm creating these smaller pieces along the way to try out different things, investigate new techniques, try and refine my old ones, possibly adapt them to work better on the larger scale. Ultimately, all to prepare me to create that bigger piece. And then for the second half of the video, we'll be diving deeper into the symbolism behind the design elements, as well as the inspiration and story behind the piece. Also, in case you missed the previous episode, here's the link to the last video in the series, and I'll also leave the link for you in the description below. Let's talk about the experiments, how they went, and what I learned. So I continued working with hooks in this piece, which I introduced in the previous video. And I started out with an experiment to try out different sized hooks as well as different colored hooks along with different sized beads just to see what would work best for this piece. And I was really interested in using larger beads. That's something that I've wanted to experiment with, but ultimately they just weren't the best fit for this piece and the smaller beads ended up working out better, so that's what I went with. And I also decided to try alternating the hooks with the eyes. So they basically come in pairs. I haven't been able to find a supplier that will just sell me the hooks. So last time when I used only the hooks, I had all these eyes left over. And this time I decided, well, instead of doing that, which was wasteful, why don't I try and use both of them? Because for the previous piece, I actually only ended up using every other hook when I was attaching the warp threads. So I figured I only needed every other hook in my chain this time. And so if every other hook was replaced with an eye, it should work out, right? And it did. I mean, the experiment was successful. But I found that attaching the hooks to the eyes was a little bit more challenging to hold on to because the eyes are flatter than the hooks. And so that slowed me down. So I think I'm going to experiment with that again in future pieces, but I'd also like to try the other technique of just using the hooks before I decide what works best, because attaching the hooks to each other was much faster. I also tried a different hook placement for this piece. So looking back at the previous piece, you'll see that the way that the hooks are attached, they're very visible. They take up space between the warp threads and the frame, so they're in full view. And I was not a huge fan of this aesthetic, so I wanted to try and attach the hooks in a way where they would be less visible. which is what I tried to do with this piece. And although the experiment was successful in that I have completed a piece and the hooks are less visible, as you can see, I did run into some issues with, especially when I was beading close to the edge of the frame, where sometimes the warp threads would become unhooked. Which wasn't a big deal because it was pretty easy to rehook them back on using a crochet hook, but it was kind of annoying and it did happen quite a few times. So I think in future, a couple solutions would be to experiment with another placement and see if I can angle the hooks in a way where it's harder for them to become unhooked. And I could also create a design where I'm not beading right up until the edge because that's where the real issue was. I also experimented with working in sections for this piece. As opposed to what I do in most of my pieces, normally I would start at one end of the loom, do an entire row, complete that row, and then start a second row, and then a third row, and so forth. Now, for smaller pieces, that works really well, but because my aim for this project is to work on a larger scale, it's just not as practical or as fast doing one row at a time when your piece is gigantic. And so this was an opportunity in this smaller piece for me to start working in sections and see how that works out and what issues I run into. So the first thing was, once I finished my first section and I started my second section, I was like, how do I connect these? I'm not really sure. And so I tried a few different ways. I threaded my new rows into the old rows. In some sections, I tried just sewing them in a couple of beads. In some sections, I didn't attach them at all. And I found that different techniques yielded different results, but none of them were really as perfect as just doing an entire row and then row after row. Which makes sense because if you're sewing in new rows to the old rows, that's going to change the attention a little bit. It's also going to mean that there's a little bit more extra thread moving through the beads. And so I found that I got some seams. I'm going to try and show you on this piece using the light. And I think you can see how the light moves across the piece. There are certain areas where it almost looks like there are, those bits are raised or like there's a wave in the piece. Which, the reason I did this piece, this experiment on this piece is because having waves on the surface of the ocean, which is what this piece represents, is on theme. It works well enough for the surface to be a little bit wavy. But ideally, I want to find a way to do this where I'm able to produce a more uniform finish. And so I did find that sewing the ends in to the old loops worked a little bit better. So instead of sewing them into the beads directly, I think for the next few pieces, I'm going to try to continue working with attaching the new rows to the old rows in a way where I can minimize the wavy effect. And I think I could also build those ends into the design itself, especially because I want to work with geometric patterns for this project. If I can build those seams into the end of part of the pattern and the start of the next part of the pattern, that might be a nice way to camouflage it. Another issue I ran into was that I was having a hard time maintaining the alignment with my bead rows. So normally when I work on one row at a time, I make sure that the beads are perpendicular to the warp threads. And if I have a square frame, that's even easier. But in this circumstance, with an angled frame and working section by section, I was finding it a lot harder to maintain that perpendicular alignment, and so my bead lines ended up being a little bit wavy. In future, I would definitely pay better attention to the alignment. I think just having that awareness would be helpful and yield a better result. And I also think that if I had, I have a mat that's actually behind me that has a grid on it. So if I were to use a grid underneath my piece, that would definitely be a huge help for maintaining better alignment, and that's something I'm going to try down the road. Something else that's kind of curious that happened is that I ended up having to add an extra bead every 20 beads or so. But the reason for that I found was, again, because I was working in sections. So normally when I work in my usual way where I'm doing one row at a time, it's easy for me to control the tension for that whole row. But in this piece, because I was working section by section, I was not maintaining the correct tension that I would need in order to keep the number of beads steady. So I would have had to bead the sections slightly looser, but I didn't know that at that point. And so I ended up having to add an extra bead every 20 beads or so, which for this piece was not an issue because of the style of the piece. It was very forgiving and it was a color gradation, so it didn't interrupt the design in any way. But for future pieces, definitely something for me to be aware of. If I am working with a design, I would need to figure out the tension for the row across the entire piece and then let that guide me for the tension for each of the sections. So the way that I would do that is simply to bead the first maybe 3 lines into the middle of the piece, going from one end of the loom to the other end. So that might take a little bit longer, but at least then I would have an idea of what the tension needs to be for each of the sections, just to make sure that I wasn't going a little bit too tight at any point, which would then create extra space that wouldn't really fit into the design. I will also add that if I wanted to reduce the amount of space between the warp threads, one way to go about it would be to attach the warp threads on an angle. But that would also mean that I would have to create a design where I had planned for that. So maybe we'll try that out in a future piece. So much of my work is about trial and error and problem solving. And I realized at a pretty young age that if I had a problem I needed to solve, if I needed to figure something out, even if I just needed inspiration, my best course of action was to go outside, go for a walk, and clear my head. There's just something about this combination that worked really well for me. And so I would spend a lot of time walking. Like, I'm talking hours and hours and hours, and I used to feel kind of embarrassed that I needed to spend so much time alone, outdoors, walking, and just doing my thing. And I didn't realize that at the time that it probably had a lot to do with me being neurodivergent. I just knew that it was something that made me different. There was this moment, like I remember when I had my autism assessment, one of the questions was asking me about my ideal daily routine. And I just felt so relieved to finally be able to tell somebody that, you know, if I could do anything and organize my day the way I wanted, I would like it very much if I could do my preferred activity, which is walking outdoors, every day. Like, that would just be the one thing that I did all day. That would be my routine. Basically saying, hey, there's this one thing that I really love that makes me feel good, and I just want to do it all day, every day for the rest of my life. Probably made me come across just a little bit autistic, which is not surprising given the reason I was there in the first place. But now that I have a better understanding of myself, I'm able to make better sense of why I am the way I am, and I've come to accept the fact that I need a lot of outdoor activity. And this is probably one of the most noticeable ways that being neurodivergent has shaped my life as well as my creative practice. And that brings us to the story of how I got the inspiration for this piece. So a few years ago, I was living in Cairns, Australia, which is a city that's located in the northern part of Queensland. It was winter at the time, but like it's pretty tropical, so not your typical winter at all. I'm talking 27 degrees Celsius every day, or almost every day. You know, maybe 20 degrees really early in the morning. Little to no rain. Sometimes you get a bit of a mist, but overall, just gorgeous weather. Ideal weather for me. So probably one of the best winters of my life, honestly. But I was going through a period of transition at the time, and so I was wrapping up the last season of Loom-In-ESSENCE, and then I was also processing the fact that my father had just passed away, so I was taking some time to unpack that. And what better way to do that than to go on these really long walks every single day? So I think I walked over 500 kilometers that month, which means that I averaged over 17 kilometers a day. So yeah, I walked a lot. But I would wake up every morning, probably around 5 o'clock, and I would have a shower. I would head downstairs to, please don't judge me, I would go to McDonald's. So here's the thing. The hostel I was living in, the kitchen was closed until 6 a.m., so it's not even like I could make a coffee where I was staying. The kitchen wasn't open yet. And the closest thing that was open that had coffee was McDonald's. So I would go to McDonald's, I would order a oat cappuccino for breakfast, and then off I would go on my merry way to walk along the ocean and watch the sunrise. So basically the best way to start the day if you're me. And that month, those moments in nature, they just gave me so much solace and peace. And it made me wonder if people know that this connection with nature is available to them and how much it has to offer them, which is what inspired me to make this piece. I chose the symbol of the ocean to represent nature in this piece, and the ocean itself is a symbol for so many things. For mystery, healing, inspiration, possibility, the unknown, the unknowable, and something so much greater than ourselves. I tried to mimic the visual of the ocean through my palette choice, as well as by combining a mixture of matte and lustrous beads, with the hopes of capturing that feeling you get when you're staring at the ocean and you just lose yourself in that moment. You forget about yourself and you're mesmerized by its vastness and beauty and watching the sunlight sparkle against its surface. Creating this piece has given me the opportunity to spend time contemplating my relationship with nature. And you'll notice that many, if not most of my pieces, I prefer to use unprocessed wood, unprocessed branches, so that I can process them myself, letting the natural shape of the branch remain and allowing it to determine the shape of my piece, instead of what we usually do with wood, which is process it into uniform pieces and use it for building. Which I have to admit is pretty practical for other purposes. You can think of it as the difference between building a frame out of wood versus using a branch to create a frame with. This approach is symbolic of my relationship with nature and my desire to build with it and have it play a role in shaping my work. Over the countless hours I've spent with nature, it's become one of the most significant relationships in my life. And I have to say, I've come to feel a true sense of friendship with the land, the oceans, and the sky. And although nature is the physical system through which our needs are met, meaning it provides us with our food, water, oxygen, sunlight, warmth, shelter, and literally a physical place to exist in, it's also so much more than that. It provides us with opportunities for enrichment, engagement, adventure, joy, surprise, discovery, collaboration, and even connection. It's also the perfect place to practice being present and, take in the epic beauty of the natural world in all its striking glory. I mean, just look at it. It's absolutely stunning. And there's something particularly uplifting about the combination of being outdoors, moving your body, and being present. And I'm sure there are a myriad of scientific reasons why that is, but you don't need to know what they are in order to be able to discern how good it feels to be out there. These days I feel far less self-conscious about my intense need for physical activity in the outdoors. And I've come to accept that this is probably part of my expression as a neurodivergent person. And that maybe it's a gift that this relationship has taken up so much space in my life, and maybe it's something worth sharing with others instead of trying to hide, which is why I made this video, and I'm sharing it with you. Now, the good news is you don't need to be autistic and ADHD like me in order to experience the joy of the outdoors, movement, and mindfulness. I'd argue that it helps, but I don't think it's necessary. I invite you all to give it a try, to cultivate this practice and this relationship with the environment, and to let yourself receive the benefit from it. So put down that screen, go outside, get a move on, and immerse yourself in the present moment in whatever way is accessible to you. And you don't need to travel to a destination or find a forest to hike in. It can be so much more simple than that. It can be going for a walk around the block on your break and noticing the sunlight sparkling against the snow. It can be opening a window and listening for the sound of birds while you close your eyes and take a few deep breaths if that's more accessible to you. Your way might look different than my way, and that's okay. Do your version of it, whatever works for you, and let yourself find comfort, clarity, connection in these brief moments of presence. And remember that despite all the horrors of the world, there's still beauty, joy, and inspiration out there. And it's my hope that this piece serves as a reminder of that. Before we wrap up this video, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the support of the Canada Council for the Arts for making this project possible. Thank you so much for your support. And thank you to the viewers for sticking around to the end and watching this video. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next installment. See you next time!